Welcome to the show. I'm Andy Hagans, and today we're discussing the global energy trilemma and what it means for investors and for the space overall. Joining me today is Stacey Morris, head of energy research at VettaFi. Stacey, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Andy. I'm glad to be with you today.
Yeah, and I love, having analysts on the show, talking with them, getting that kind of objective view of things. I also love entrepreneurs. So I kind of like to talk to everybody, but I just want to say to the audience, I have huge respect for VettaFi, their coverage of energy exchange traded products, really high quality stuff. And Stacey, I looked into some of your writings, obviously, before you came on the show, some of your columns at ETF Trends. I think this is stuff investors want to be aware of in terms of trends in MLPs, which we're going to talk on later on. But one article in particular that really grabbed me was solving the global energy trilemma, um, a common sense approach to the energy transition. So, why don't we just start with that term, the energy trilemma? What does that mean?
Yeah, so it really refers to this kind of problem that the world is trying to solve. And what we're solving for is essentially secure, affordable, and lower carbon energy. And so when you think about that, that's a huge issue. And it has a lot of different meanings for different parts of the world, and different implications depending on kind of where you are geographically, what kind of natural resources you have available to you, what your economy looks like, all these different things. But at the end of the day, that's really what this trilemma refers to is trying to get the world's population energy that is secure, affordable, and also has lower carbon emissions.
And it's almost, I don't want to say it's impossible, but it kind of reminds me. I have a background in entrepreneurship, and my one of my very first mentors was talking about marketing and product sales, and he said, "Good, fast, or cheap. You can pick two out of three. You can be good and fast, you can be good and cheap, or you can be fast and cheap. It's almost impossible to deliver all three of those things at the same time, right? So if you're, it's kind of like, are you Walmart? Are you Louis Vuitton? Are you fast food? Are you fine dining? All of those products and services are fine, but they're all positioned differently, right? And that kind of reminds me of the energy trilemma. It's like, well, secure, inexpensive, and clean. Is that even possible, or is it kind of like an asymptote that we can kind of get closer and closer to, but never really totally get there?
Well, I think there's a couple elements to it. I mean, to your point, there are things that are very secure and very affordable that maybe aren't as clean. Coal maybe would be, that example.
Mm-hmm.
There are things that are clean, like solar and wind, and the affordability there has improved over time for sure. So, there's elements of, different types of energy having different types of these characteristics. And so I think at the end of the day, what I believe is that it probably takes a combination of a lot of different type of energy sources, right? There isn't one silver bullet for solving this problem. And so I think that's what's kind of the important thing to kind of keep in mind. And that kind of keeps it in the realm of being possible, maybe versus, feeling like this daunting task that will always be impossible.
Yeah, so it's the whole, the big picture, the holistic picture. And I mentioned earlier, I always like speaking with analysts because I think a lot of times you all can see the big picture, right? Whereas if I speak with a lobbyist on behalf of renewable energy or a lobbyist on behalf of oil and gas, it's usually you're kind of seeing things from that one perspective, and it's hard to have balance really when you interject politics. Do you think that politics has really kind of warped, I don't want to say the science, but maybe the popular understanding of the science in the energy space?
I mean, I think politics definitely plays a role in the energy landscape. And I think politics also can kind of maybe sometimes skew how people think about the world or the reality of what energy consumption looks like in the US or globally. Maybe
Mm-hmm.
skewed by things that you see that are more political headlines or developments by governments, things like the Paris Climate Accord. So, you know, on its surface, I would think, we passed the Paris Climate Accord several years ago. I would assume coal demand globally is going down just on the surface of many countries coming together and so many countries working together to lower their carbon emissions. And in reality, last year, coal demand was at an all-time high. So I think sometimes people's perceptions can be shaped by things they see in the government or things with the Inflation Reduction Act. And you see all these incentives for clean energy. So you assume a lot of those technologies are there today or being deployed. And it's maybe not what people think. So I do think there is an element of politics playing into this. Certainly, government can be supportive of different types of energy, and the Inflation Reduction Act is a good example of that. But certainly, there's an element of politics kind of playing into this and impacting perceptions, maybe apart from reality in some cases.
Yeah, and I mean, in some cases, I'm glad you brought up the Paris Agreement because but I'm also glad that you talked about wind and solar are becoming less expensive, right? Because I can kind of see both sides of the coin where the renewables are becoming more efficient and more cost efficient. So that's progress, right? That's we're gaining ground. But the Paris Agreement, the goals were so aggressive. I don't want to say unrealistic, but I did just say unrealistic. They were so unrealistic. It appears to me that the trajectory that we're on is wildly trending under that, right? So it's like you have to decide: are you going to be an optimist or a pessimist, or maybe is there space to be the realist, kind of in the middle?
I think there is a space to be a realist, and you can be optimistic about the outlook for things like solar, wind, and electric vehicles, but also realize that you know we're not going to be in a world with 100% electric vehicles anytime soon, or there's kind of a adoption curve to a lot of these things, and a lot of this will take a lot of time. I think what I run into a lot is um, optimism, but then also maybe overestimating how long energy transitions take, and how difficult it is to replace a certain type of energy that you're accustomed to using. And so um, I think it's okay to be, optimistic about things and have a hopeful view, if you will, about how things may change. But I also think there's a big element of needing to be realistic, and especially in the context of this trilemma, what's affordable, what's secure, what's available, and not just what's low carbon. It's going to kind of take everything, and it kind of goes back to an all of the above type energy strategy.
So, in your coverage at VettaFi, which of the different energy sources do you cover as their own sector? Like, do you cover obviously you cover natural gas, oil? You do cover renewables? You cover coal? What are the different sectors that you cover?
Yeah, so predominantly we're focused on oil and natural gas. So I'll admit my bias there.
Mhm.
That's where I've spent most of my career, but I also spent a lot of time early on the sell side covering renewable fuel companies as well. Companies back then that were really kind of at the forefront of trying to take things like algae or sorghum and turn them into sustainable aviation fuel or other types of biofuels. So I've dabbled a little bit in both, but predominantly spend a lot of my time on the oil and natural gas side. And I think with that, interestingly, also with the Inflation Reduction Act, you're spending a lot of time looking at things like renewable natural gas, renewable diesel, where your traditional energy companies are playing in those spaces, and actually kind of can stand to benefit from some of the incentives in the Inflation Reduction Act. And that might be surprising to some people as well, as the amount of interest that traditional energy companies are starting to have in some of these cleaner energy technologies. I mentioned renewable fuels, but also things like carbon capture in particular, hydrogen, which is still very early stage. So I predominantly focus on oil gas, but spend a lot of time looking at all sorts of types of energy at this point.
So, some of those other technologies you mentioned, would you classify them? They're almost different types of renewables or renewables that sort of intersect with the conventional energy sector?
Sure. So in the case of like renewable natural gas, for example, or renewable diesel, what's nice about those is they're drop-in fuels and they're fully compatible with systems that we have today. So I could put diesel through a pipeline and then I could put renewable diesel through the same pipeline. And so that's what's nice about some of those technologies and why you see energy companies more focused on those. Something like hydrogen, you can, for example, drop into a natural gas pipeline at maybe like a 5% type blend, but for captured carbon dioxide or hydrogen, you're probably going to need your own kind of dedicated infrastructure. So some of it is, very kind of plug and play with what we have today and conventional fuels, and then some of it is, obviously needing more of its own infrastructure and more of its own infrastructure from a demand perspective as well, right? Like I could put renewable diesel in a diesel truck and it would be fine. And being clear about renewable diesel, not biodiesel. Biodiesel, you can only use up to a certain blend. But hydrogen, you need a demand source for that hydrogen, whether it's a power plant or some kind of transportation vehicle. So there are some kind of key distinctions to make between what's more on the plug and play side and then what kind of needs some of its own tailored infrastructure.
So you've talked about some of these myths, that kind of persist in the maybe, with mainstream folks, maybe don't understand the sort of pain, I guess, involved, the economic lifestyle pain involved with too quick of a transition to renewable energy. Another trend that I've observed, a lot of people have observed, is with institutional investors, endowments, pension funds, ESG obviously becoming a bigger driver there. And there being a bias against investments in conventional energy. Do you see that affecting where capital is flowing kind of on the, on a macro scale? Is that does that ultimately mean that, there's less investment in conventional energy, versus what just a pure supply and demand investment thesis would it connote?
Yeah, I mean, I think you do see some impact. We have seen some endowments and pensions adopt divestment programs. For example, that have a mandate that they won't invest in coal companies or things like that. And we have seen those announcements over time. I think it kind of varies by geography too. I mean, a lot of that has been more European focused probably than what we've seen so far in the U.S. But on the other hand, if you think about last year when the energy sector was particularly strong and not much else was working, we saw, I think a lot of people become more interested in this space than they have been for a while. So, for me, I think there's some investors who don't want to touch this space for whatever reason. And maybe it's an environmental concern, maybe it's another issue. And that kind of is what it is to me.
What could, I'm sorry to interrupt. What would that be another issue? If people don't want to, is it just the volatility of oil
Volatility could
prices?
be one issue. For example, some funds avoid energy because it's cyclical, and the mandate maybe to avoid cyclical sectors
Mhm.
for whatever reason, because you have a long hold strategy or something like that, and you don't want that potential cyclicality. I would say probably most of it is more on the environmental side. Occasionally, you see some backlash from a corporate governance perspective in the energy space. Not as much now, but at times there were people complaining about CEO pay in this space, for example. So there could be other reasons that people choose to avoid energy. I would say probably the environmental concerns is a big one, or in that same kind of vein, just concerns about the longevity of oil demand or natural gas demand.
Yeah, I mean, my personal 2 cents on the oil demand. I mean, in the long enough time period, could the industry dramatically shrink, go away? I don't imagine it will be in my lifetime unless I live to be, 120 or something. There's various predictions on when we will see peak oil demand, right? I don't really worry about supply. I mean, I hear people talk about peak oil supply. I'm like, personally, again, I'm like, I don't think you really need to worry about supply, right? If you believe in the invisible hand, supply is going to follow the demand. When prices get high enough, it will be cost efficient to get it out of the ground, right? Do you have a particular, source or, in terms of peak oil demand, is there any particular date or timeline that you tend to subscribe to?
I mean, my crystal ball is probably not that much better than anybody else's, but I would say that I think in the past, we've seen people call for peak oil demand. A lot of people thought that 2019 was going to be peak oil demand after the
Yeah.
pandemic, when we saw basically oil demand fall 8 million barrels per day in really short order in 2020. So I think there's been a lot of claims around that already.
Mhm.
And I think just in general, there's a lot of more run room there than people appreciate. And just to hit on a couple points there, I mean, a lot of the oil demand growth we see is related to petrochemicals. People don't tend to appreciate how much of our plastics and things that are surrounding us in our offices
Right.
actually come from oil. And
Our iPhones and our computer monitors
exactly,
and
the
our
pizza,
Patagonia fleeces or whatever.
maybe not Patagonia. I don't know. They're pretty strict things, but
I guarantee they're still using petroleum somewhere in their manufacturing chain. But yeah, okay, fair point. Fair point.
but anyways, but yeah, to your point, there's stuff all around us that people maybe don't realize comes from
Yeah.
oil. And you think about all the things we have here sitting in the US and the things we take for granted every day. And then you think about, the rest of the world and populations that don't have all these plastics but would one day like to have them, or you think about what a growing middle class in certain parts of the world can mean for petrochemical demand. And so I think that's a really underappreciated story when people think about oil demand over time. There's so much hype around electric vehicles, and that's just kind of one part of it, right?
Mhm.
If you look globally, this is also pretty interesting. Um, there's about a billion or so people in developed countries like the US, Canada, Western Europe, etc. If you look at how much oil is used per person, it's about 10 barrels a year more than everybody else in the world. And that everybody else is almost 7 billion people. So you start to think about countries developing the resources that we take for granted. And at some point, that gap starts to close. That would be a lot of oil demand. Now, I'm not saying all of the developed world is going to get their energy from oil. Certainly that's not the case. But I think, it's easy to think about things like electrification and electric vehicles and this transition. And I think the perspective for us in the developed world is very different from the perspective of somebody else in other parts of the world who maybe doesn't have all the things that we take for granted. I mean, there's still about 750 million people in the world that don't have electricity.
Right.
So, this is it goes back to that trilemma and this being such a big problem. And there's not a one size fits all solution for every country or every you know type of people group around the world. And so I think that's also something that's important to keep in mind when thinking about kind of the global energy landscape is how drastically different the playing field is depending on where you are in your economy and the resources you have.
Yeah, and that where I guess I won't get political here. Maybe this is a little political, but that's where when the renewable side kind of takes the quote unquote moral high ground. I'm like, look, you could take the high ground with me and say, Andy, your kids don't need the 100th Lego set or whatever, or your family doesn't need the second vehicle, or you absolutely take it with. But folks in developing countries, a lot of times we're talking about food, shelter, education, the basic goods and services that we take for granted. And what's been in the news lately has been peak population, right? Malthus was wrong. We're not going to end up with a world with 30 billion people. I don't know if it's going to peak at whatever, 9 billion, 10 billion, whatever it is. So at some point, that is a tailwind for less energy usage. But then you have to consider, well, if 7 billion or kind of the other, you take the 1 billion richest people outside of those, what about everyone else on planet Earth? And if they have a lifestyle that's even half as wealthy as that first billion, that's going to imply a lot of growth in the demand for conventional energy. And even if we're generating electricity from solar, from wind, from other sources, we still need all of these petrochemicals for manufacturing, right?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's exactly right. And I think there's a lot of talk about, what does a fair transition look like? And Arjun Murti, who's done a lot of work on this at Veriton, he's a former Goldman Sachs analyst. He has a lot of great research on this. If people are interested in digging into this more, I'd highly recommend him as a read, because it is, to your point, one thing to talk about, what you should, the standard that you should be held to, in your example and your kids' Legos and your second vehicle, versus, other parts of the world where, people are still burning, wood essentially to cook and to heat their homes, and where a propane stove or something like that can be, really helpful and actually lead to a cleaner, environment. People kind of don't think about, how dirty wood burning is. But that's another kind of interesting point where a fossil fuel like propane, or in some cases natural gas, can be cleaner than burning just biomass. So, anyways, there's a lot of different like elements to that, and what is fair and what's right, and it's certainly above my pay grade.
Well, I'm sure it's above my pay grade too, but that never stopped me from, expressing a half-baked opinion. Give me a microphone and a podcast, and I'm happy to, to spitball. We're almost out of time for this segment, but one thing I wanted to touch on briefly, I know you're located in Texas. I always think this is interesting because corporate boardrooms to me appear to be more and more similar. There are exceptions though, and to me, energy, especially conventional energy, is a big exception, right? It's culturally very different, I think, than a lot of other corporate sectors. But I'm curious about you, Stacey, personally. Are you an investment person covering energy, or are you like an energy person that happens to also, be an investment analyst?
Yeah, so I guess I started my career on the sell side doing equity research, and then I actually worked for an oil refiner for 4 years doing investor relations for them. So I've kind of sat in both seats, and I would say I would call myself now an analyst covering the energy space.
Okay.
But yeah, certainly in the energy space and in finance and in the roles I've had over my career, it's certainly very male dominated, and a little sometimes lacking in diversity, to your point, although I think it has gotten better over
So, I mean, I am on the outside looking into the energy industry. Is that still true? Do you think in 2023 that the energy industry is culturally different, even at the corporate level, compared to other sectors?
time. I think in some ways, yes. And some of it, I think, also has to do with geographies and where people are based, and
Mhm.
the cultural elements of people from Texas or
Brooklyn versus Dallas, right? Or LA versus
Yeah, there is, I
Houston.
think, a
Yeah.
little bit of a
Yeah.
difference there, but I also think it has gotten better over time. I think there's been a reputation in the energy space of it being kind of a boys' club, if you will, and I think that
Mhm.
has gotten better over time.
Okay. Well, good to know. Stacey, thank you for joining us today. We're going to bring you back on our next episode to talk a little bit about MLP. So everyone stay tuned for our next episode. Stacey, thanks for joining the show today.
Thanks so much for having me, Andy. I appreciate it.